Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls come tumbling down. You may talk about your people of Gideon, you may talk about your people of Saul, but there ain't no one like good old Joshua in the war of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls come tumbling down. Up from the walls of Jericho, he marched, spear in his hand. Go blow down ram horns, Joshua cried, for the battle's in my hand. That's why Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, oh, Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls come tumbling down. Amen. Amen. First, I'd like to thank Reverend Tamara Moreland for this really warm welcome. Thanks for inviting me. And to the many helpers that have helped me since I've walked in today. I've been invited to many churches to come and preach. And I would like to thank Sister Sharon, thank you so much. And all the deacons that have scurried about this morning and tried to get this service prepared for you at hand. Today's sermon comes from Isaiah 28:18. And your covenant with death shall be disannulled, and your agreement with hell shall not stand. A covenant is a bond of action. It is an agreement on the part of one party with another to do something which is either right or wrong. Covenant agreements do not necessarily make it a thing that's right. It may be right or wrong, irrespective of covenant agreements. If the thing be right, it may have previously arisen out of our duty as subjects of God's moral government. In that case, covenant engagements could impose no new obligation, but only enforce a duty which existed without such engagements, a duty which arises out of the very circumstances of our relations and is a binding force, whether we bind ourselves to do it or not, or whether we are even willing to do it or not. If the thing we covenant to do be morally wrong, a covenant of any nature cannot make it morally right. If the thing be wrong, a solemn covenant cannot make it right. In all those covenants which regard religious duty, the righteousness of the duty is determined by the will of God and not simply by the terms of the covenant in which it is embodied. It is indeed true that the covenant itself sometimes contains the revelation of that will in regarding to the thing for the first time. But even then, it is not the embodied expression of that righteous will which gives the covenant binding force in regard to the thing. As God neither wills or commands anything that is wrong, he cannot consistently, with his rule of rectitude, make or sanction a covenant that binds men to do wrong. The same is true whether the action is contemplated to be between himself and man, or between man and man. Hence, all those promises, oaths, agreements, and covenants which originate among men and are intended to operate between man and man, to having binding force, must have regard to right. No law, covenant, or agreement can legalize wrong in such a sense as to give it the character of moral rectitude. Right is right, and wrong is wrong. And we are ready to stake our virtue, piety, and total all upon the simple and broad truth that nothing, absolutely nothing, can in any sense or degree be binding upon any man whomsoever, if it, the thing assumed to be binding, is morally wrong. In any agreement, covenant, or compact which assumes to legalize and bind men to do moral wrong is positively, by virtue of its conflict with the will of God, it's null and void. A very strong evidence of this is brought to view in the text. Those to whom the text was addressed had in their wickedness made a solemn covenant with death and a strong agreement with hell. But God declares that he shall be disannulled and that the other shall not stand. Why? Evidently because the thing aimed at in the covenant, which was wrong without the covenant, and of course is wicked with it. In the light of these remarks, how many of the laws, oaths, promises, compacts, agreements, usages, and ordinance among men having high sanction, consecrated with great veneration, and baptized with as much solemnity, will be swept away? Such are the laws and compacts designed to legalize a system of human bondage. I'm sure you knew I was going to make a point. In our further discourse on this Thanksgiving Day, I designed to bring to the test of this reasoning the agreement contained in the federal Constitution on the part of the northern states of the Union to deliver over to his claimant, the fugitive. We quote the clause: "No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such a service or labor may be due." This is the constitutional compact, so often and solemnly appealed to as establishing the duty to hand over the fugitive to his claimant. Let us show, 1, what this agreement involves; 2, that the thing enjoined is a moral wrong; and 3, that it has in the sight of God no obligation. I am to show what this agreement involves. It is an agreement to do what? It is an agreement to aid in taking away the liberty of human beings and to give them galling chains in the stead. The declaration which preceded the Constitution some years happened to settle some important things just here, which the Constitution, thought it clashes with them, cannot unsettle. Among other things, that every man is born free and endowed with liberty. This, we hesitate not to say, is not the doctrine of the Declaration of Independence only. It's not a mere rhetorical flourish, nor is it a truth which may at certain events pass as political truth under certain circumstances, but it is a truth which has its foundation in the nature of God, of man, and also of things. Now, the compact in question involves a perfect conflict with the truth and is designed to deny what this affirms, that man is free, and take away what it confirms, that man, all men, possess liberty. Let us look more closely at the point. Here comes a man from the state of Maryland. He is a stranger, but we see that he is a man, one of those whom truth declares to be born free and possessed of liberty. Why should anyone doubt that he is free? Perhaps no one would think of it, doubting it under ordinary circumstances, but here arrives another man from Maryland, and this lays claim to the other man. The compact comes in here as the umpire and says that this claimant shall have that his claim, no man shall interfere, but it shall be the duty of all to respect his claim and to abstain from throwing any impediment in the way of his enforcing it. In other words, to deliver up the claim to the claimant. This clause, viewed from any point, is a covenant to do this thing. 3 points are assumed. One may claim, another may be claimed, and a third must deliver the claim to the claimant. Does it not involve just what the text points out? A covenant with death? I am to show the thing here involved is a moral wrong. We are oftentimes told that this is a political question. Granted, but what next? Does that place it out of the range of morals? I hope not. I depreciate the idea that politics have nothing to do with morals. What do you think? Though this is then a political question in its relations, it's moral in its nature and must be tried by a moral test. It is a sin to hold a man in slavery. If you enslave a man, you do not only rob him of his own dear liberty and happiness, but you rob God of his rights as a creator and redeemer of that man. And what does this lack to constitute it as a sin? It is wrong to admit the right of property in man. Will you tell a man that it's wrong to steal and then turn around about and tell him that he has a right to do it under such circumstances? Admit the right of property in man. What is it but admitting that a man does not belong either to himself or to his God, but to another man? If a man owns a piece of property and holds an exclusive, good and proper title, and if it is wrong to take that man's property for the very reason that he held an exclusive title, can it right to admit the validity of any other title? But this is what the compact before us does. It goes to admit that one man may be the property of another. God's title to him and his own title to himself, to the contrary, withstanding. Is it not right to aid in establishing the right of property in man? Establish the right? It cannot be done. A thief may successfully carry off another man's goods, but does not establish his right. So much right as he has, he steals along with the property. I will rather say then that it is wrong to help to attempt to establish the right to this property. Now, these last two are what the northern states of the Union have covenanted to do, and it is wrong, morally wrong. The southern states have done the first, namely they have committed the sin of holding man in bondage, and the northern states have covenanted to admit and to aid in establishing their right of property in man. Morally wrong. There is not a man of sound morals in all of New England whose feeling would not recoil at the idea of putting forth his hand in aid in giving up a fugitive slave. I am prepared to take the ground and to show accordingly that this covenant involving a moral wrong is not binding upon the aiding party. The difficulty presented is this, that the agreement is interwoven in the Constitution and that it cannot be broken without breaking the Constitution, and that's treason. Now, we are constitutionalists. We do not want to break the Constitution, but we want to mend it, for we contend that just at this clause, there is no Constitution as applied to slavery. There is a breach here which is only filled with dead letters. Dead letters. What is the Constitution? Is it a sovereign over the will and the power of the people? No, it is the creature of that will and power. Now, the will and power of the people is supreme in all matters, where they have the right to exercise will and power. But we state here as a position that in this clause, there is an assumption of power which the framers of the Constitution never had lodged in hands. Let us suppose that they had placed a clause in that Constitution to this effect, that every British traveler that came within the American jurisdiction should be retained. What right would it be asked have they to detain British travelers? But it might be answered then, as now, it is the Constitution. Hence, the question of right, they would say, has long since been settled. It was simply by framing and adopting the clause. What would John Bull say to that? He would appeal in such a way to make but little ceremony with the Constitution against this clause, and he would appeal to the Declaration of Independence. That declaration places personal liberty among the inalienable rights of all men. If personal liberty be thus the inalienable right of every man, then no power on earth can alienate it, not even the Constitution, which is 12 years younger than the Declaration. And we must need assume that the Declaration was written, adopted, and signed under circumstances far better calculated to secure a correct decision upon the matter in hand than those under which the Constitution was brought into being. 2, I appeal to the occasion of the Declaration of Independence. What was the situation of the 13 states at the time that the Declaration was moved by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia? They were allegiance to Great Britain. They were a part of the British Empire, and things which they complained as tyrannical, which they claimed to be a justification of their act in dissolving what allegiance were acts of the British king with the concurrence of his parliament, and therefore constitutional. But the states took the ground that a sovereign had no right to exercise power in subversion of his legitimate authority, and consequently that all such acts were null and void and of no binding force. And for the justness of the sentiment, they appealed to the judgment of the civilized world and to the judge of all that doeth right. The events of providence, the sense of the world, and leading minds in Britain have joined to attest that the sentiment was correct. Well, what do we gain by this fact? We fairly gain the position that this is a practical application of a practice principle, that it is a principle for no one age exclusive, or to guard the rights of no one people only, but it will apply anywhere and at any time. Our views may be summed up in the following form. To deliver up a fugitive from bondage is to commit a moral wrong, period. In taking away a man's liberty and reducing him to slavery, period. But nothing is binding that is morally wrong. Therefore, to deliver a fugitive is not binding. To go out in the street and catch that man and bind him in hand and foot and send him into Maryland slavery must be absolutely right or absolutely wrong. It cannot be right and wrong at the same time, either in part or in whole. If it is absolutely wrong, which we claim, it cannot for any time or any being be right. But we shall be told that since we have sworn to do it, we must do until the oath be filled. We answer that the only thing which concerns us here is the rectitude of the act. If its performance is not right, morally right, no oath or covenant can bind it upon the conscience for one moment. Is a man bound to steal or murder because he has taken an oath to do it? Will the two wrongs make one right? As evidence that this clause is not obligatory, we allege that it is conflict with the total design, scope, and spirit of the Constitution itself. In the preference of this document, some 6 specifications are made by way of setting the groundwork, people giving their reasons for framing and adopting it as follows. 1, in order to form a more perfect union. 2, to establish justice. 3, ensure domestic tranquility. 4, provide the general welfare. 5, promote the general welfare. And 6, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Here is the spirit of the Constitution, and noble spirit it is. But in order to convince my hearers that the clause in question is in direct and palpable conflict with this spirit, I have only to ask, what would one of those objects are not absolutely hindered by this clause? I allege against the obligation of this clause, the example of good men required by government to do wrong. Daniel and his companions, they went into a burning fiery furnace. Daniel into the lion's den sooner than comply with the rules and regulations of government requiring them to do wrong. The apostles and primitive believers, they took the same course. Against the force of this clause, I allege the authority of right reason. There is not a man under the sun who might even be disposed to aid in handing over the fugitive to his claimant that can show any rational motive for it. At the very moment he might be enraged in the act, his reason would revolt and would feel as guilty as if he had laid his hand on the Son of God to lead him to the cross. And for my own conscience' sake, I should as soon do this as the other. I am sure I say this advisedly. Yes, my Savior were again to be on earth, I should be soon go to Jerusalem, and there, in obedience to the mandate of Jewish prejudice, betray him for 30 pieces of silver, as to be an agent in delivering on demand a poor fugitive from bondage. Against the force of this clause, I allege the palpable duplicity in which it involves. If the language of the clause be interpreted strictly and legally, it means no more than to give the master power to reclaim his apprentice and the employer the hireling in a case where he had contracted for a year and drawn half his wages and then absconded. This is what it would mean. If there was not a slave in the land, if it were used for this, we should have no quarrel with it. But political tradition says that it would not have been there at all but for slavery. Now, this is duplicity. If they intended to mean slaves, why not just say so? In the showing of the clause, there is a palpable falsehood. How long since the slave owned service or labor, or will help the slaveholder to make his account so as to bring the slave in debt? Against the power of this clause, I allege the direct command of God, Isaiah 26:3-4. Here we are commanded to make a shadow to hide the outcasts. What kind of shadow does this clause propose to make? What outcast does it hide? Where does it permit them to dwell in our jails. Finally, I allege our text. Does anyone doubt the modesty of calling this a covenant with death, an arrangement with hell, as it is intended to affect the slaves? Let him think of the bleeding hearts and the manna-clad limbs, the nakedness, the starvation, the darkness of mind, the premature death, and all the loss of the immortal soul to which it is accessory, and say it is not a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. What God pronounces a nullity. And now, dear hearers, just consider for a moment that while we are giving thanks for liberty and while North Carolina and Maryland are doing the same, George Lattimore, a colored man, is under this clause, shut up in a Boston jail on claim of J.B. Gray without the benefit of the ministry. Yes, mark it. While we are giving thanks, this man is denied the common humanity extended to even a criminal. Ministers are not allowed to visit him on the subject of the salvation of his immortal soul, but where is this scene? In Virginia? No, but in Massachusetts. Oh, speak that lowly. Don't let Charles Dickens hear that, lest he write another volume of Notes on America. This James B. Gray is now awaiting the decision of the court to take his victim back, as he says, to Virginia, where he was avowed his determination to kill him by inches. The clause authorizes these things to be done in sight of Bunker Hill Monument. Shades of Warren and Putnam, revive and shed us another breath of your immortal fire to purge the shrine of freedom. God of liberty, save us from this clause, and thanks shall be thine forever. Amen. Looked over yonder, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home. A band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home. If you get there before I do, coming for to carry me home. Tell all my friends I'm coming soon, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, oh, coming for to carry me home.